Before I do, she didn't think of the botanical garden as a place that could hold a bad memory. It was where she went when a day had been too bright for her apartment's dimness, a place to stand under glass and listen to water decide on its edge. Even in winter, when the conservatory ran the heater just high enough that the palms didn't sulk, it smelled like damp potting soil and fertilizer with the sharpness of iron railings. She took pictures there because the colors helped her stomach remember that it was allowed to want things. On Sunday, the sky over Silver Bend had a skin of white cloud that made every parked car into a shallow mirror. She took the bus because she liked arriving without having to think about where a machine would rest while she walked. She wore the green coat because the wind lifted and fell, and she didn't like being fooled by a sunny window into thinking that outside would be kinder. She carried a thermos because the benches where the seniors rested were cold, and her mother's old text about tea, "Drink it before you done to need it," had never quite stopped living in her. Halfway through the season, she had taught herself how to make a selfie not about her face. She caught the edges of things, an arch, the rise of a hill of time, and then let herself be somewhere off to one side with the same mild half-smile she used when a clerk said, "Receipt in the bag?" Sometimes she stood fully in front of the roses because there is a little cruelty to refusing to stand in front of a rose, as if you had not understood what the day demanded. She liked the part near the waterfall because the path was close to the wall and the sound was constant without being a drone. She took 3 pictures there, one with the spray catching the light and making her hair frizz in a way that would annoy her when she saw it later, one looking up toward the bridge where people put their elbows and looked down, and one impulsive, from too near the water where the phone made the drops into stray planets. She never remembered the click happening. She had turned that sound off the first week she owned the phone. She had learned from a woman on a train who had looked at her with something like pity that no sound keeps your pictures safe, only attention. When she got home, she put the thermos in the sink and the tea made a brown swirl on the silver. The refrigerator hummed and then stopped and then hummed again, and she put a hand on its door out of habit as if her palm could smooth it into one tone. She kicked her shoes off without untying them, another habit, and made herself promise that later she would sit and undo the knots like a person who respected her own laces. She settled into the corner of the couch with the blanket that had pilled into small bobbles from last winter, tugging. She scrolled, the trellis first, good light, her face in the bottom corner where her mother would have told her to take up space, reluctant and there. The waterfall, a sharp line, and 100 blurred droplets. She put a thumb on the first and watched the phone stretch the picture until the shapes had that too near grain. She told herself a small list of things that did not require a list. Send this one to Jem. Look up what the blue spiky flowers were called. Remember to call the gas company. Wash the towel that smells like metal. On the third swipe, she froze. Her body hesitated the way a person does when they are standing by an escalator, and the step they anticipate is not the step that comes. Behind her left shoulder, the bushes near the azaleas gave up some shadow that had not been there when her mind had stored the scene. A shape that might have been an absence of light took on the cuff of a sleeve, and then a coat, and then the idea of a face, blurred, too near leaf shade to count as face and not as trick, and the angle of the head was wrong for someone looking at flowers. It was the good, clean wrong of a look reserved for a camera. She reached her thumb back and forward, trying to trick the picture into rearranging this person into a trick. The image stayed itself. Next, tulips, the stripe of the bed ahead of a stone bench. Her smile was wider than she remembers having made a smile, because the couple next to her had been arguing over whether their child was old enough to kick her legs in the pond, and it had made her want to hold the day still. In the background, on the near side of the marble, a dark coat belonged to a person not sitting because there was no sitting shape in it, only the vertical lean of someone who has decided not to let weight rest. The blur of a face stared not at the bench, not at the other couple, not at the child who had blown a blast on a reed like a trumpet, but forward past the angle of the tulips to where she had held the phone in her two hands and tried to get the angle not exactly right. "You were there," she said into the quiet of the room, as if saying you could make a person inside a phone move or apologize or become a coat hung on a peg, and a boy with a haircut you could let yourself ignore. The room did not offer words back. The refrigerator decided on humming for a stretch. The radiator ticked once as the heat tried and failed to make a case for itself in the apartment's cold corners. She scrolled back. The trellis again, dark coat in the leaves, a shadow that read as skin, not precisely because of color, but because of how the mind knows the living lacks the right angle. She shifted on the couch, and the cushion made a sound like a bag, and in the reflection in the black of the screen, just for a knee's worth of heartbeats. She saw herself, and behind herself, not the kitchen doorway or the plant with dusty leaves, but a patch of darker than shadow, as if her screen had found a way to overlay the real with the real. She held the phone close to her chest and felt the case make a cold shape under her sternum. "No," she said quietly, the way a person in a hallway says it when they run into someone whose name they haven't remembered yet. She went back to the cascade. Up on the bridge, a blur of height, a coat leaning over as if the person inside it had no concern for the rail. The picture had been taken at such a poor angle that what was visible of the figure might have been a dark shirt with a white sleeve behind it that had decided not to engage, and yet it arranged itself as a shape that had chosen to gather those things into itself. She put the phone face down. The kitchen looked different, and she did not know how to live with a kitchen that had been altered without any involvement from her. The sponge lay on its side on the counter. The refrigerator hummed at a pitch she had not noticed earlier. The faucet pointed its mouth at her plant like someone's finger. She picked up the phone and looked at the plant instead, because a plant keeps its innocence if you never ask it anything hard. It was the lavender field that undid the part of her that had been practical all day. In that one, the flowers had thinned into a strip between the path and the low stone wall. She had stood and bent a little as if to breathe, a little of a pretense, because the sign had said not to crush the stems. The person stood at the edge where the lavender stopped, too near the path to be mistaken for a gardener, too wrong in posture to pass for anyone resting. The face looked toward her as if the blur had had the same instructions as the camera. Focus on the nearest eyes. She put the phone down in the place where the couch arm met itself. She lifted her thermos in two hands and tried to drink, and the tea had acquired the taste of pennies. She swallowed, because swallowing is how you tell your own nerves to return to their usual work. She stood up, because sitting felt like a decision she had forgotten she had the right to make. Her apartment was a small stack of polite decisions. She had accepted its worn carpet and learned to make a virtue of the allowed wall hooks. She had chosen the couch because her hips had decided a lower one would betray them on winter mornings, and the little half bookshelf had been chosen because it was cheap and did not pretend to be anything but a rectangle with promises. The towels she had chosen because she had convinced herself that towels were a place a person could permit herself to prefer softness without having to explain wanting anything else. The towels were clean. She had washed them yesterday in the building's machines that like to make the basement smell like a storm. She went to the window and looked out and saw nothing but the cul-de-sac and a three-legged cat deciding whether the night had finished deciding about rain. The traffic light at the bottom of Station Road ripened from red to green to red so politely that it made her want to write a thank you note. She turned and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the place where the orange towel with pale stripes had been folded after laundry. She lifted it and set it down, and nothing in the world protested. She looked again at the phone, because looking at the phone felt like turning a page in a book where you regret what you have learned and cannot stop. She went backward. The first picture from the entrance, where the big map shows you what you will not get to today. He was there, a darker pane between the reflection of the entry hall, S-glass, and the side of a large fern, at just the distance where you tell yourself that the reflection of a person behind you has been tragicomically educated by the phone, S-lens, into the centeredness of a different man. She pinched outward to zoom. The lines sharpened. The face refused her. She went forward. People talk about the horror of numbers and long nights and the word again, but there are other kinds. There is the horror of seeing something ordinary that you should have noticed and didn't, and the body punishes you by noticing everything in the universe for one breathless minute. Each picture had in it the idea of a shape the camera believed in more than she did. If this had been the day before, she would have seen coat and sky and boys with small voices and an old man at the koi pond taking a picture of his wife. But the wrong day makes every damn thing rewrite itself into one idea. A person has nerves in their skin that wake when watched. She'd always thought of that as a myth, useful, a story bodies tell themselves to reward vigilance. Standing in the doorway, staring at her phone, she felt it in 3 specific places: the small of her back, the soft part where the skull gives up and the hairline begins, and the meat at the back of her upper arms, where her aunt had always patted her and said she would grow into herself. She put the phone down on the counter and turned deliberately around, which is both more terrible and less terrible than letting yourself spin without thinking. There was no one in the kitchen. The tea towel over the oven handle hung evenly, which she liked because the handle forced evenness, not because she demanded it. The mug in the sink thought only of its own ring. The corner where the fridge stuck out because the apartment had not been built for this size gleamed with the stainless steel her landlord had bragged about. She stared, her breath tucked into itself in that quiet way you breathe when you remember trying to hear where a parent was in the house. For 3 seconds, she believed she would see the coat behind her in the glass of the fridge. Instead, she saw only the room the fridge had eaten, smeared kitchen shapes, people that were not people, but the lie of light, described by a brushed finish. She went back to the couch. She put the phone down face up because the reflection in the glass made sense again. She set the thermos on the table and caught herself before she made a ring and put down a coaster and didn't trust her own carelessness, and then realized she could not live in a place where rings were important. She took a breath and felt the inhale and the exhale and made herself let her shoulders be heavier on the soft. She told herself stories she believed and did not believe, and waited on the hinge of them to see which way the door would go. It did not feel like a decision to start looking through the older pictures. But the body is old and the mind is old, and together they make a habit look like a new plan. This was not the first time she had used a screen as a way to make a room behave. There were pictures from last week. Her kitchen table, her friend Jem's hands holding a ring she had not put on yet, and a video she had taken of a woman on the bus when the woman's earbud cord had curled like a tiny white question mark. Back 2 weeks. A picture of a receipt with numbers that she had wanted to prove to herself would be reimbursed. The botanical garden then too, on a Thursday after work, when the conservatory had been almost empty and the air had smelled only like fans. She enlarged one with a swipe that had become fluent, her face nearer, the path behind her. A boy with a bright jacket and a man with a dark coat leaning closer to the succulent wall than the sign would have encouraged. "I would have noticed," she said when she heard herself. It wasn't a spoken sentence. It grieved itself out of her mouth. The man in the coat did not move because nothing moves in a still except you. She went back further. A street fair 2 months ago, funnel cake and women with hair pulled up because July wanted dampness in everything. The figure was there behind a food truck, an unkind blur that might have been a shadow of shade, or might have been a shape with a jaw and a goal. A grocery line with oranges in a net bag, and a price concrete enough to retrieve in memory, and a man behind her holding a coat rather than wearing it because the store had had the heaters on high. She stopped. She put the phone down, as if putting it down could put the air back in her lungs. She counted the hums, one from the fridge and one from the fan in the bathroom, and one, which should not have been, a faint hum in her ears that she thought until now was only the room changing its clothes. At some point, the body reaches for the most ordinary thing in the room. She reached for the towel. She folded it another time, which it did not need, and ran the texture between finger and thumb until the edges lost their insistence and the truth of it. That it was clean, that it was her choice, that it smelled like the lot behind the laundromat where the soap water splashes. Had its say over what the phone always makes you think truth is. The phone lay on the couch as if it had finally done its mischief and wanted to return to being a machine. She slept in clothing she had not planned to sleep in because taking off the green coat in the bedroom felt like waking up something. She clicked the lamp and closed her eyes and opened them 3 times before the lamp believed her. She heard the far-off siren that belongs to another neighborhood and the tick of the baseboard heat deciding how long it wanted to be responsible for her comfort. She thought of very small things, not because she believed small things have magic, but because tiny is honest and rooms understand that. In the morning, she did not look at the phone until the tea water had gone singing. She stood at the sink and watched the steam press out and counted 1, 2, 3 counts after the kettle had asked her to remove it. She watched the traffic lights through the kitchen window and saw them behaving themselves except for one cycle at the bottom of Station Road, where the yellow hung 30 seconds too long. She told herself that the timing had been altered for reasons that had to do with the feeder road behind the supermarket, and that there were people whose entire morning had been organized by those seconds, and those people had the right to be thought of before a coat in a picture. She looked. It is what a person with a living mind will always do: return to the thing that is not looking back and pretend it is a friend. The pictures were where she had left them. She scrolled through in the morning light, and the figure had the bad grace to be present with the same patience as last night. She wanted him to be an artifact she had taken into sleep and now read into everything. Instead, he was an artifact of itself, a man in a coat who had either through camera trick or through choosing to be in the field of her phone, S-view on purpose, stood near her and behind her and above her in different places on different days, in ways that made it possible someone might say the words pattern and stalking in the same sentence. It is a strange intimacy to imagine someone watching you who is not supposed to be able to watch you. She had had a cousin in another city who had asked once to borrow her login so he could watch a premium show, and had then, politely by accident, seen which movies she watched late at night. His text had been an apology in the shape of not saying anything, and then saying something gentle about how the old ones are the best. She had changed the password and told him that she had, and tried to keep the part of the story that had been shame only a story with a moral for herself. The man in the coat had the same wrongness of someone seeing you, where you are meant to be invisible unless invited, without the cover of apology or the excuse of a cousin who is almost a family joke. She drank tea quickly and burned the roof of her mouth and told herself that her body would finish the boil in its own time. She was supposed to open the library in half an hour. She worked 2 desks a week there because the library did not care how many degrees you had if you could be kind to quiet. She had time for a small rational action. She imported the photos and then, after making sure she had imported them, deleted them from the phone because that felt like reinventing control. She emptied the trash. She looked at the home screen as if it would be cleaner now, and it was the same home screen it had been yesterday, with a smear near the top from a hand that had been peeling a clementine. On the walk to the bus stop, she looked at every coat. You cannot prevent your mind from counting samples once counting has begun. Dark coats, 3. Black jackets, 5. Men with hoods, 2, and one who had a hood but had chosen to let his neck be cold. She stood with her hands in her pockets and told herself that she was allowed this scanning because a person is not obligated to be polite in her head if the politeness would cost her calm. When the bus arrived, she looked at the glass. Reflection. 3 people, including her. Evening bus glass often produces a faint second mirror toward the depths. Morning gave her a single self in a single pane. She sat, and the vinyl seat grabbed at the back of her coat like a timid hand. The library's morning opened obligingly. Some places make their own weather indoors. This one liked a steady climate. The scanner on the desk made a little noise after each book as if telling her gently, "You got it." The small printer went through a mood at 9 and printed a stream of half-reset letters, and she reached over and lifted the lid and laid it down as if calming a child. The bulletin board had a flyer for the community garden cleanup that always used the same photo of last year, cleanup, because the record of people kneeling in dirt looks hopeful, and nobody had taken out their phone to make it into a better advertisement. She did not tell Jem. She did not tell anyone. The part of her mind that runs PR for the rest of her said it would be unkind to put a bad picture into Jem's head. She checked in 3 times with the part of her mind that makes phone calls about heat and said, "Not yet." At 10, a woman came to the desk and asked in a voice that said the answer mattered more than it should, "Do you print pictures here?" People always thought of picture printing as somewhere between a secret and a favor. She took the flash drive and plugged it into the terminal meant for it, and watched while the program that the library had chosen 4 years ago, before she had been hired, opened and considered its choices. The woman had pictures of a dog standing in a doorway and pictures of her daughter in a shirt with too many flowers. In the picture at the Farmer S Market, there was a man in a dark coat behind her daughter, blurred because the program was focusing on the peach. She felt her mouth make its small deciding motion and made it stop. The woman chose the dog and the peach, and one of the pictures where the girl S-head was at a forgiving angle. The printer made its noise, a confident little throat clearing between sheets, and the woman laughed once at the dog being finally a photograph. "It smells like a school," she said, "of the ink and the paper and the hint of ozone that the machine left in the air." She leaned forward. "You always have to think of something to make this place smell like home." "Tea," she said, "old book glue, and the inside of a ballpoint pen." The woman laughed again, more sincerely. She left with the pictures between cardboard and the same nervousness you have carrying a dessert to a place where other people will judge it. At noon, she ate her sandwich in the back room, because the fluorescent light makes the lettuce go paler, which could be called a shame if a person believed lettuce had dignity. Her phone stayed in her pocket, with the camera lens pointed safely into fabric. She took it out and laid it face down on the table and finished chewing and told herself she could look at the Garden S announcement email instead. The email said the greenhouse roof would be closed until further notice because of a maintenance issue. "Out of an abundance of caution," it said, because those words belong to people who must speak for the safety of others. It said a maintenance contractor had noticed a hairline crack in one of the large panes, and the inspection had indicated more. "We appreciate your patience," it said. "We believe the indoor collections will reopen Thursday." When she returned to the desk, she noticed how small moments had been rubbed raw by the day. A man walking backwards to look at a poster made her want to raise a hand so he would stop before he reached the chair. A child at the Lego table made the peculiar fake cough that equals a laugh. The barcode scanner missed a beat and then corrected, and she flinched. She thought she saw in the glass of the library door, as someone pushed it open, the blur of a coat where the coat was not, but it was only the reflection of a man across the street adjusting his hat. And she made a brief, humiliating study of how many ways a coat could be a coat before it became a person. She slept poorly Tuesday because the body respects the stories the mind tells it, even when the body pretends to ignore them. The refrigerator ran too long, and then not long enough, and the radiator made that ticking coordinate with the recitation of a thought that insisted on being thought. At 2, a siren went up and went down. She lay with the light off and watched the bright rectangle of the blind where the street threw up its own day. In the morning, she told herself she would look at the garden photos only with daylight and with other people near. She took the bus downtown to the camera store that had survived the decade because people like Fiona, who wanted prints from a day in a conservatory, and men with rigs needed paper to make what they saw into a thing other people could touch. The clerk with a name badge that had been turned into a question mark by time said, "How many?" And she said, 10, and felt like a child who had misunderstood the assignment. She loaded them wirelessly, which made her realize that the shape of a picture could be anywhere in the building at once. She watched a tiny circle tell her that computers believed in doing one thing at a time. "They'll be ready in an hour," the clerk said, and there was mercy in the word hour because it promised a limit on the nervousness she was allowed to let herself feel about the idea of walking out of the store with paper that would tell her the truth. She set a timer. She walked to the river and watched people feed bread to the geese, and then listened with that very small interest one lends to arguments about whether feeding bread to geese is cruelty or kindness. A man in a dark coat walked along the other bank. It was a coat in February. It was not a message from a camera. When she went back, the prints were in a white envelope with her name spelled with the T that made new clerks think they heard something different. The clerk smiled and handed it over with an offering motion the store had taught her. She did not and could not open the envelope at the counter. She walked to a bench that promised a little shadow that wasn't shadow exactly, and sat and slid the stack out. Her fingers found a rhythm, look and place down and look and place down. The paper had a wetness to its texture still, the cool of the finish. The first picture was so good that she felt sorry she had not let herself see it without the context of dread. The arched trellis made a little architecture, and her face, half in it, looked like someone who had adopted the manner of a person worth photographing because they were excited to be near something that should be photographed. Behind her, inside the leaves, a dark coat found the negative space. It wasn't printed into the picture like a watermark from the store. It was printed into her day, 2nd, 3rd. The figure replaced a bright place behind the white bench, the waterfall, the bridge, the lavender's cloth-like field with the man at the edge. The paper did the small curl it does when a hand that is not thinking of oils on fingers holds it too long. The man was in every picture where backs and fences and human constructions had given him a place to belong. It was not somebody else in a coat. It was the same coat and the same attitude of attention, as if a universe had decided that this was the angle by which to convey menace through 1,000 small choices. Possible, her mind said, because it had learned to summarizing. A co-worker of someone in the picture, a person with a life, a person who strolls where he will. The other part of her that has made lists since childhood said, too many, and put a number beside the wrongness, as if a number could fix anything. She put the prints back in the envelope and walked home by a longer route to avoid the pottery store, where the lady with the soft voice was seasoning mugs as if they were cast iron. She did not go in because she could not keep herself from buying another cup, and she could not afford that habit as a way to manage thinking. She got to her building and climbed the stairs because the elevator S negotiation with gravity sounded like a polite argument. When she put her key in the lock, it faltered once and then consented because it always did. She set the envelope on the kitchen table next to a receipt she had written "thank you" on, so she would remember to thank the person at the shop who had undercharged her for the roll of tape, but would likely not, because she is the kind of person who lets gratitude become a calendar reminder and then resents herself for it. She went to the sink. She washed the thermos from yesterday because she had not, and it felt like a confession to go without. When she set it upside down on the rack, water rolled over in a clean film and then broke into beads, and she watched the beads fall one by one like someone counting proofs. The towel near her hand was not orange but blue with white edges, and she dried her hands on it firmly, rubbing as if friction could bring blood back under the skin. She would delete the photos from the device where they could sneak up on her. She would keep the prints because she refused to let a picture and a man in a coat make her someone who pretended she had not had a day in the presence of onions and roses and cranes. She found the folder and pressed and chose "delete all" and watched the phone ask twice if she was sure. She was sure. The phone made the empty gesture that devices make when they act as if they are sending a deed into a void that saves us all. She opened her camera and pointed it at the sink, where a plate had been set aside to dry, and captured the way water held to the rim like soft hands. The picture was clean, no one behind the plate. She turned it on herself and took a half-joking picture of a mouth that did not want to smile and eyes that had, out of politeness, asked for permission in the mirror. The picture was only her. She felt the relief in her pectoral muscles, an odd detail that chest-held tension, and did not trust it for a second. She is not a person who learned to trust relief. It had been a visitor too rare to deserve the couch. She scrolled to the oldest images, a place where phones are honest because they were young then and the world was simpler, and then scrolled back to the top of the gallery and saw the lavender again. She had just deleted them. Her hand went cold. Her throat made that careful little swallowing motion that the body makes when it will not admit to nausea. She pressed and got what she expected, the option to select and delete, but the icons refused to show that they had ever left. The names of the flowers, the bridge, the black coat in different angles of the life she thought she was having, stared back as if they had always been there and always would. She opened the settings. Storage space agreed. With a gentleness she found offensive that the deletion had occurred. New numbers reflected the emptiness she had requested. And yet, the pictures designed themselves back into place on the screen and into her day, like someone who meets you at every corner and calls it a coincidence. "I'm not a child," she said to the refrigerator, which now hummed at a pitch that did not make sense with the room's size. She set the phone down and went to the bathroom and washed her face and looked in the medicine cabinet mirror and saw the particular flatness behind her eyes that means a person has been arguing with herself and lost tactically in order to win strategically. She went back and took the battery case off and put it on, because a little ritual is a polite way to tell a device you will treat it right, even when it won tea. She tried to think like a person who had worked at a help desk for a year vacation between real jobs. Clear cache, reinstall app. She created folders and moved things, and that worked until it didn't. And then she saw that moving anything out of a certain container returned it to the top of the stack, like a letter a postman without a uniform keeps putting through the slot. She plugged the phone into the wall and let it sit there like a cat that you hope will be domesticated by furniture. The afternoon needed to be used. She had promised Jem she would help go through boxes. Jem was planning to sell some things and keep others, and had asked for her eye because it had a reputation for general calm. They worked for 2 hours under the light that made the dust look like a bit more was ordinary. They sorted. They did not talk about the coat or the pictures because she did not let herself in a room with cardboard and somebody else's history, and because Jem, who noticed all sorts of imagined things, but not this, was telling the story of a bus driver who had saved a kid's glove from the floor and made a little drama of returning it that everyone on the bus had decided to participate in by clapping. Someone somewhere in the building dropped something like a rolling pin in a kitchen. It made noise in 3 rooms, and then the building decided it had only happened in 1. By the time she walked home, the traffic light at the bottom of Station Road had hiccuped twice between green and yellow in a way she had a hard time unseeing after, because once you have seen an object be fickle, it becomes part of its character to you, not a one-time error. Wednesday morning, the Botanical Garden posted a notice that the glass house would be closed until the end of the month. She had expected this. The half apology that institutions make had primed her to be patient. "For your safety," the announcement said. "We appreciate your understanding." It was accompanied by a photograph of the bridge near the waterfall, empty of people and heavy with the feeling of being arranged. She glanced at the printer near the circulation desk because she had learned to predict a parade of patrons printing that note and feeling satisfied to be the kind of person who knows. When the usual 3 arrived, she handed out paper, smiled at the relief of it making their day. One of them had a picture of the bridge printed on cheap copy paper with the announcement underneath, and behind his shoulder the printed coat stood in the printed near shade, looking at a printed version of her phone. It was an image that had been made in a different moment, with different intentions, but the arrangement was the same, down to the lean of the head. "Printer's not great," the man said, apologizing for a machine he didn't own. "Never is." He folded the page in a firm way that crumpled the coat into the fold and left her breath inside it. At noon, a child came to the desk and asked if she could see the fountains. "Tomorrow, maybe," she said. "They're fixing some glass." "A glass like mirrors," the girl said. "My mother says not to look too long, because then you forget your real face and look your pretend one." "That's a lot to think about," she said, and the girl shrugged, as if this was an old thing that could be put down any time she liked. Wednesday night, the fridge hum grew teeth. A clicking came from it like a tooth being sucked. She wrote a letter to her landlord in her mind, and kept it there because people do not need to be woken for sounds that could be managed with appliance patience. She ate the remaining soup in a bowl too large for it and felt the weight of porcelain. The towel, tonight orange, scratched in a friendly way. She noticed herself putting on socks with a care that made her think of old women, and then punished herself for the lack of kindness in that thought. She slept. Thursday, she woke with the feeling of having been watched. People say that in a small way when they are trying to be humorous about a poster of a cat that looks toward a couch. She meant it like the body means it, like eyes had touched her when she was asleep. She went to the window and saw the cul-de-sac and the cars and the 3-legged cat negotiating with its conscience. In the reflection in the window's low morning, she saw a coat behind her left shoulder. She turned, and there was the plant and the towel and the doorway, and her stomach did that slow flip a person does when they think of something terrible at the exact moment they must be brave. She held her phone up, turned the camera toward the window, and saw only the window. Some tricks work only in certain mediums. She lowered the phone again and looked in the black when the screen had gone to sleep. The coat in the glass of the phone's face moved its head a fraction, not as if to follow her, with love, with hate, but as if a person had glanced downward to where the picture would be taken. The world swam once around her ankles, and then righted itself because gravity is a friend even when the world is not. She took to leaving the lights on in rooms she wasn't in, not because she believed it spooked anything living, but because the in-between dark that happens when a person passes a doorway, it is a vacuum you can avoid filling if you are generous with electricity. She watched the numbers on the meter because she had been raised to do so, and told herself she would atone for the extra in March. On Friday afternoon, the library had to post a notice that power would be intermittent. because feeder work on the east side meant the grid would do what it could with what it had. Out of an abundance of caution, the email said, because everyone in the city uses same phrase in the same week. Please avoid using elevators during the window if you can use the stairs. The patrons squinted at this, because stairs in this library were a thought from another century and lived backstage. She made the announcement 3 times and felt her voice learn a good teacher's calm. Her own building sent a similar notice, electronic and with a misspelling that made her unreasonably fond of whoever had sent it. She decided to pack a bag and go stay at Jem's if it got irritating. She did not tell Jem about the coat because her mouth could not find a shape for the story that did not sound like a child with a conch shell. The power went out at 6 before dinner, and the way the building took a breath was friendly until it wasn't. She realized how loud electricity had been and how much her fridge had contributed to what she had thought of as silence. She lit a candle, not because she needed a candle to see, but because fire is a person in a room. She did not open the fridge because she had been taught not to in these cases. She sat and listened to a street where traffic lights behaved like 4-way stops, and men with big trucks showed their characters by how they handled that. She did not look at the phone. She did not. She set it face down and then turned it face up again, as if it could breathe better that way. When the candle moved, the shadow in the phone moved too, and she made herself wait through 10 breaths before letting her hand go there. When she turned it on, the screen stayed black a fraction too long, and she prepared herself for dead and for relief. Then the logo came, and the faint song the phone makes to say that it has returned to being the center of your day. The picture that came up was her lock screen, a cloud with an edge, and she had the small gratitude of it being just that. She set it down and stood up and did a circuit of the room like a person reassuring a boarder. The stove gave its coldness. The window gave the street, which gave the people who believed that the rules of an intersection were suggestions. The plants gave their leaves because they had no choice about that. When she made the second circuit, she found nothing new, and that calmed something enough that she could sit down again and forget for 3 minutes to be self-conscious. The power came back with a complaint and then a full-throated hum that sounded like gratitude. She ate crackers because soup without a functioning stove is sad, and she did not need the habit of sadness this week. She put the towel away as if making a gift of it to tomorrow. Sometimes the body decides when the transition from morning person to night person should occur, and it is not always late. She brushed her teeth as if oral hygiene were a ritual that made the border real between days. She thought of the coat and then thought of her cousin who had viewed her watching of a late-night movie and wondered which of these could be easier to tell someone, and then decided neither for now. When she lay down, the fridge made its little goodnight sound, which it learned from years of appliances that had told each other how to make their owners less anxious. She closed her eyes and didn't. A small noise, a click, a soft static. Her eyes opened. The small noise again, not electrical. This was the sound a person holding a sweater makes when they decide they will put it on without putting the lights on. She held her breath because she belongs to the wrong school of thought about people who break into apartments. She believes in the classroom belief that if you are quiet, the teacher will not call on you. She listened and realized with embarrassment that the static was in her ears and the sweater was no sweater. It was the fridge returning from a loud day. She turned on her side and saw the door to the hallway reflected in the window. In the reflection, someone stood, tall enough to have to tip their head just so to avoid hitting the overhead light when entering. The coat had the wrong sheen of a man who does not understand fabrics and wears weather no matter what the sky has done. She did not sit up because sitting up would make the hand reach the phone, and it would make the phone reflect her and the coat, and she could not manage the ethics of that tonight. She watched in the reflection, which is like learning to understand your own handwriting in a mirror. easier than it should be once you make yourself pretend the letters were designed for this. The figure in the coat did not move toward the bed. He stood and then did the small flick down of the eyes to the place in his hand where a person would check their phone. It broke the tension the way it does when you realize that the person you are afraid of is merely a person. It also made a different tension because the movement in the reflection did not belong to anything in the room. Sleep, she told herself, and did in seconds the math of her safety. Locked door, chain, window latched, phone on a nightstand that would be too loud to lift, her own breathing a small sea that notified her of all waves, real and imagined. She slept in episodes. She woke and slept, and dreamt that she had found a new door in her hallway, which when opened showed the coat on the back of a chair. Saturday she went downtown to the police station and sat in the uncomfortable chair and said to the woman behind the glass, "I don't know if it's anything." She had rehearsed telling this in a way that made her sound apologetic for taking up time. She told it with fewer details than she would have liked, because the moment you begin that kind of story, you see yourself as the woman on a bench with an envelope full of pictures, and you want to spoon the story into the officer's ear like soup, so she will swallow it without asking what yes in it. "Do you know who this person is?" the officer asked, and the relief she felt at being asked this simple question was sharp enough to hurt. No, she did not. She thought of the word pattern and did not say it. She spread 3 prints out, as if making her own evidence would give her the right amount of control over how the desk surface would be used. The officer leaned. She breathed, and a trace of gum came to her across the glass. "He could be a person who goes where you went," the officer said. "He could be 2 people with the same kind of coat." She didn't say ghost or photography trick. She was kind in that she did not laugh. "If you see him in person," the officer said, "turn the other way or call us. If he comes to the building, call us." She wrote down a number on the back of a pamphlet about personal safety. The pamphlet had a local brand logo on it that felt like a dissonance in a room about fear. "Would you like to make a report?" She said yes, because yes made her body feel like an adult in a chair. The report lived in a computer that wasn't working properly, so the officer put it on a paper that looked ashamed to exist and promised to enter it when she could. She put her name at the bottom with her middled initial, because at these desks she always is asked to have one. She put her phone number. She wrote the conservatory as a place, and then, when asked, admitted that it was also a street fair and a bus and a grocery and a day that had not belonged to this week. On the way home, she stopped at the market. Food has sometimes been for her the only thing that can make her feel sensible when a day has not agreed to be so. The barcode beeps at checkout were the same pitch they had been last week and the week before. The fluorescent light overhead clicked in a way that told her a ballast had wanted to retire and had not been allowed. The cashier said, "How was your day?" in the tone of a person who had grown up with a father who had expected hello and its congenial reply. She said, "Greener than I expected," and the cashier looked as if she had heard poetry and then realized she had simply been offered the weather. She snapped the receipt out when it printed the paper curling in an obsequious way, and she put it into the bag when the cashier made the face, "People make that equals. I will keep this in your shopping if you will pretend you want it." She walked with the bag biting into her fingers and appreciated the way the plastic did not apologize for its lack of compassion. She did not look up at her window. It indulges a certain belief about double frames and foreboding. She had learned not to give into it unless in a mood. She got upstairs and set the bag on the counter that perpetually looked like it had given up small wars. She put the bread away first because she is a person who cherishes bread. The fridge hummed as if to reassure her that it still knew how to do its job. She rinsed grapes and listened to the hose-like sound because a faucet can be made to imitate a boat at night on a television, And she loved that sound in the way a person loves anything that made them feel small in a way that did not punish them. The phone reached its face toward her. She did not want to be rude, which is the sentence that makes people forgive themselves for returning to pain out of obligation. She opened the camera roll and found the pictures still there in a folder marked in her storage as empty. It does not matter what words a device uses to reconcile contradictions. The picture of the waterfall made the sound in her chest like paper tearing. "Okay," she said, to an apartment with one person in it. She sat down and opened her laptop, which had the offended air of a cat that is forced to be beautiful. She looked up words, artifact, computational photography, rolling shutter, and retrospective focus. She learned about face detection being a thing that happens even when you do not ask for it. Not an act of naming people, but of naming personness, so the device can push those photographs at you later when it thinks you want to remember. She read that ghosting can happen when a device is too clever and makes a half frame from the frame before survive into the next, if there is common structure between a leaf wall and a coat. She read that reflections can override subject. There was a paragraph in a thread about image persistence in screens and the way that an earlier image can leave its ghost when remapped violently between memory and display. It made sense in the way things do when you have read 12 paragraphs that contradict each other gracefully. It may appear that an element follows the viewer between images, the post said, and it was accompanied by a glazed picture of a person with a square hiding their face. She set the laptop aside with the care a person uses when she wants to make her mind believe that she has not admitted defeat. She opened the pictures and tried to unlearn the man in the coat by learning how everything else could have been a fault of a too smart machine. When the door between cognitive interpretations is opened, drafts come through. She stared until her eyes made their own colors. She stood and walked away, and her legs felt like she had been sitting too long, and they were punishing her for it. She slept with the bathroom fan on and woke with a dry mouth and drank water that smelled like a penny. She decided to give up softness for a day, not because being hard would make the day less weird, but because there is a punishment we give ourselves when we think we have become silly. She ate oatmeal with none of the kindness she usually gives it. She wore a coat that was not green. She looked at the traffic light at the end of Station Road and dared it to do something unusual. It behaved. On Sunday, she took the long bus to the far end of the garden because the river walk there makes a corner that the rest of the city seems to have forgotten. She stood under a beach and tried to make her breathing an object she could analyze. The river breathed for her because water is patient in a way human bodies cannot be. People on bicycles moved through time, and she felt that she could almost believe in them and not in a coat that had learned how to cross pictures. Then the wind shifted, and the reflective surface of the river turned the bank into the kind of screen you can make a life on. Behind her shoulder in the water as black, a figure stood and regarded a version of her that did not know how to refuse fear. She turned. It was a tree. She turned back. It was a tree in the water too. The reflection remade its geometry. The shape that had been the coat belonged to normal things, a trunk, a human imagination with nowhere to go because the city had been too polite to lock her in. She laughed, not nicely because she was laughing at herself, and a woman nearby gave her the small permission smile you give to a stranger who pretends she had told herself a joke. Jem called and asked her over for tea. "I have a new kettle and I don't know how to use it," Jem said, as if this were a personality trait. And she said, "I'll be right there, because showing up is a way to help people without being in charge of any real help." They drank tea from mugs that had been held by 3 different women in their lifetimes, and she told Jem about a man at the police station who had asked her to pick up a flyer because they were short on stands, and she had felt sudden anger at the institutional meanness of being stingy with cardboard on the day a person asks for help. She did not tell Jem about the coat, In the middle of the second cup, Jem said, "It looked like you didn't sleep." And she held her hand up like someone being sworn in and said, "I slept in installments. I'm trying a new format." Jem laughed and touched her wrist, and then took her hand away and then looked at the hand as if it had decided something without her. Monday, the library asked to move her to the records room because Julie had called in with a cough, and the records room, ordinarily full of a patience that borders on sanctity, needed someone to keep the climate-controlled cabinet from buzzing itself into romance with the radiator. She liked this room because it didn't offer much space for fear. The ledgers smelled of paste with a dignity. The scanner had a voice like a polite throat. You could hear the elevator down the hall, which felt like being in control of time. There is a sound a building makes when it contains tired people returning. At 10, the power blinked again, and she didn't mind because the records room holds its breath and then finishes its sentence. At 1, she got up to stretch and saw herself reflected in the dark of the window. There was a person behind her, at the distance where a person in a coat would have to angle their head if they did not want to hit the overhead light. The person made a motion with their hand, reaching out to touch the dark glass. She lifted her hand too, and the hand in the reflection lifted the smallest fraction earlier and placed its palm to the glass, and to her surprise she found that her hand did the same, that their timing had chosen to take instruction. She kept her hand there until the warmth transferred enough that she could believe in it. She dropped the hand, and the hand in the reflection dropped, and she told herself that hunger and light do things to people, and that the hairline crack in the glass house had been less frightening because it had been named. She went back to the desk. She put entries into the system. She frowned at the keyboard because someone earlier had taught it a song it shouldn't to know, and her fingers kept releasing tiny boops when they didn't want to. She listened to the building's mouth. Tuesday, the garden posted a longer note. They would be closed longer than expected. The assessment had revealed issues with supports. A subcontracted engineer had suggested caution. "We appreciate your understanding," the statement said. "We'll add days to the calendar later and honor tickets." The picture that went with it had the bridge from a different angle. In the background, the coat, another coat, stood near the copper beach. This one had a hat. She knew she was being unreasonable to feel betrayed by the hat. She preferred his terrible bare head. She closed the app and closed the phone and opened her ancient point-and-shoot camera because it had, in her mind, a morality her phone lacked. It had a sound of a shutter that sounded like cameras did when a cut-rate magician pulled one out of his jacket and everybody had to guess a card. She stood in the kitchen and took one picture of the plant with the dusty leaves. She took one out the window of the cat with 3 legs, getting into an argument with a squirrel with a large opinion. She took one toward the living room mirror, which was not a good mirror, and caught her mouth looking like a person who had eaten something that had not confessed its ingredients. She put the camera down and forced herself to wait an hour before putting the card into her laptop, as if she could let the images become real during the interim in a way their digital cousins hadn't. An hour later she saw that the cat was a cat and the plant was a plant, and the mirror had gotten its feelings onto her face, which she had expected. In the background of the cat picture, in the neighbor's window, in the second pane from the left, there was a figure near the curtain. It might have been a jacket on a hook. It might have been a man in a coat watching his 3-legged cat do battle with the lesser monsters. She stared until her eyes refused to hold the shape. She closed the laptop gently because it always made a disgruntled sigh, and she welcomed that. Wednesday was the day she knew she would have to say it to a person with a human mouth and not a desk officer in a glass box. "I think I am being followed." She said it to Ruth, who had the job of making the calendar for the library's conference room, and had the demeanor of a person whose life had trained her to have bad things told to her at awkward times. Ruth did the good thing first, listened without arranging her face into anything. Then she did the second thing. It might be some weird bug with your phone. But you know what? Do you want me to walk you home?" "Yes," she said, and felt at once both insulted and relieved that adults with friends can ask for this and get it. They walked to the bus, and then walked off the bus, and then turned onto Station Road. And Ruth H.'s presence changed the streetlight into something that seemed to belong to them. Ruth talked about a recipe for pot roast that had no right to work in a slow cooker, and about her daughter's SI exam, and about the electric company and its fondness for sending notices with little warning. They stood at the bottom of her building and she said thank you, and didn't mean to be formal, but was. "Text me," Ruth said, and she did from the entryway, because the act of asking and the act of performing have to be close neighbors. Inside, the fridge hummed. The plant was a plant. The towel was blue. The phone beside the tea kettle had a smudge from a finger that had been eating something sticky. The pictures were where they had been when she had last looked. It was both a relief and an offense. She ate like a person performing eating. She set the thermos to soak. She stood at the window and made herself take 3 deliberate breaths. The apartment's hallway light had begun to misbehave this week. The sensor was old. It believed in visitors where none existed and left the resident in the dark when a person stood very still with her key in the lock. She had once gotten locked in the dark and had cried once and then felt ridiculous because being embarrassed at human tears requires a level of spare energy she did not have. Tonight, as she locked, the light flicked on, off, on. She was aware of her own body making 3 little decisions in a row: to be frightened, to be calm, to be irritated, and then choosing irritation as a way to not be either of the others. At 2 in the morning, she woke and went to the kitchen and poured water and stood in the bright square of the window and understood that the reflection could be kinder than the real. She saw her own face. She saw behind her the plant. She saw behind the plant the hallway light go on. She saw the coat in the reflection behind her left shoulder, with its head angled as if looking at her phone. She turned around and looked into the hallway and saw only the pattern in the carpet that had been there since the building was young, and a scuff on the wall where someone had moved a chair up a stair. The reflection still had the coat. The coat lifted a hand, and she lifted a hand because she could not, and together they put their hands to the glass. Thursday, she took all her pictures, print and digital and screenshots and the bad mirror selfie and the cat, with her to a counselor, which felt like carrying contraband to a wise person for blessing. The counselor hadn't asked for the pictures, but did not push them back. "What's the first one?" she asked, and it was a question that made a memory offer itself, a thing she would not have thought to give. "The trellis and the coat and the good light on my hair," she said, and felt ridiculous and true. "What happens to your sleep? It is wrong. It stops and starts and refuses to be the right texture. And food." "Yes," she said. Food was a thing that had to be asked. She was eating, but she was less grateful. The counselor looked and did not try to reconcile the coat into anything that would dissolve. "Phones are very bad at being neutral," she said, with a whimsicality that belonged to a person who had not been punished by her devices. "We use them and they use us. Also, sometimes a person is trailed by a person. Is there anyone you don't want to tell me about?" She thought of Lyle, an old 3-month man who had texted her and texted until she had told him she does not owe him her time, and about how his texts had become a chorus of "we can still be friends," and hers had brought the repetition of "I am not interested," and how a day comes when you are no longer a person with an interesting refusal and you are a person with a thing in a phone. She said no, because she was ashamed to have let a person in a phone occupy any of this old place where a mother would have sat and taken everything and offered soup. "If your body is telling you to leave a place, even a good place, leave it," the counselor said. "If it tells you to stay, stay in well-lit places, talk to people, name what's happening, don't drink too much, be boring, be safe. She walked home through places where a woman is always a woman and nodded at the people who looked up while she passed. The police car at the end of the block had its lights on because someone in the next building had done something, and the colors reflected off the windows made the hallway light in her building see shapes where there were none. She slept in the time between events. When she woke at 4, she felt a breath of air and decided the window had been not quite sealed, then realized the window was latched and the breath belonged to the building. She lay and felt her own pulse for a while, placing a hand to find it, and wondered why this touch had not frightened her earlier. In the morning, she hid the prints in a simple place, between the towels in the linen closet, because a thing behind softness becomes for the mind less cruel. On Friday, the library had a water leak behind the new fiction shelf, and the hoses made a sound like someone washing a small boat. She thought of this again, that television sound, and the manager said they would close early out of respect for the leak. And she laughed behind her hand because people will make decisions if you allow them to be about quiet and respect. She went to the grocery, and the barcode beeps were overconfident to make up for the earlier quiet. The receipt printer was one of those models that prints so fast it seems relieved to be working. It spit a ribbon she folded and put into the bag without thinking, because she is a person who always wants proof until she cannot bear what it proves. At home, the prints were where the towels had hid them. She took the pile out and leafed through and found a hair that was not hers and felt betrayed by a towel. She sat with the lavender field again and looked for faces and shadows and allowed the names of flowers to do some work for anxiety. She stood because this week had taught her to stand when seated too long, and turned toward the window and saw a reflection of a person behind her left shoulder who moved their head down to check where a phone would be if they were holding one. If she tells this, she tells it this way. On Saturday, in the hall, in the light that does not know its mind, with 2 bags in her hand and a towel on her shoulder because she was planning to wash something stubborn, she saw a person in a coat reflected in the glass of the building's front door. She looked up with her eyes and saw a hallway. She looked back into the glass and saw the person in the coat look into the glass as if to confirm something had not and will not change. She pressed the door button to leave, and the button made a sound like an old submarine, and she told herself 100 tiny instructions in a row. Turn head, turn shoulders, turn hips, watch the stairs. At the bottom, she looked again at the glass in the vestibule, and the coat lifted a hand, and that hand and her hand met in reflection, and where they met the glass went very slightly cold. She is not someone who puts her hands up to test limits like a child and the stove. She knows where edges are supposed to be. She returned upstairs and set the laundry down in the hall and stood with her back to her own apartment door and told herself the story of being safe like a grown woman. When she went inside, the fridge tried another trick. It growled and then placated. The towel on the counter looked like a small person lying down, indecent and ridiculous. She put it away. She put the thermos out to dry. She turned her phone face down and then flipped it, and the reflection with the coat waited behind her like a patient man. She made a sandwich of things that had never cared to be in a sandwich together and let herself eat it without comment and without judging the things for showing up. Sunday, the counselor sent a message asking if she had eaten, and she wrote back yes, and then wrote back soup, because wanting to tell someone the sweetness of soup is a kind of love. Lila sent a message about a folk concert she wouldn't attend, and neither would she. Ruth sent only a thumbs up, and that made the day feel organized. Simple gestures are proof they are allowed to be here. On Monday morning, the garden reopened part of itself, the part not under glass. She went because the day would have been worse had she stayed home. She put her phone in her pocket and took a small camera that did not pretend to be clever. She walked along the outer path, past where the river had made its decision to be wider, and turned to stand in front of winter specimens that had insisted on living outdoors, and took one photo of a sign that had been lettered by hand because the volunteer is old enough to put pride into her lettering, and it showed. The coat appeared in the corner of the camera's screen when she glanced, a ghost the camera had learned from the way her mind had changed. She lowered the camera and saw a hedge. She raised and saw the coat. She moved to the side, and the coat moved the fraction of a moment it took for her brain to accept that the reflection of a person can instruct the person. She took the photo, which shows her smile arranged and the beach behind her and a coat the size of a pen. She went to the office because a person in an office can tell you that a thing you think is happening is a thing that can happen or cannot. "Weird question," she said, and the intern at the desk, who had assumed she was about to report a cut in the path or a child on a railing, brightened salt water cheerfully for this kind. "Do you have cameras near the bridge?" "We do." The intern tapped on something and made a face a person makes when she's about to tell you about a birthday present that will be late. "They were out last week. They're back now." She looked properly disappointed at this for her sake. Something to do with the lightning or with the power feeder they were working on. A contractor is scheduled. "So there wanted to be a way to see if a man in a coat was there," she said, and the intern smiled in a way that hinted this was not a sentence she would be proud to say later. "You can look at today's footage," the intern said, "but it's just people and geese, and a woman with a green coat and a very nice smile and a dark coat behind her that could be the negative space between two birches." "Thank you," she said. She used her adult voice, the one that made an intern feel she had done the right thing by blaming lightning. She went to the cafe near the bus stop. The woman working the machine, it had no right to call itself an espresso machine in this town, made her a tea without asking and set it on the counter with a sincerity that improved the tea by a grade. The fridge under the counter ran like the fridge in her apartment. The cups were stacked not quite straight, and she straightened one with the back of a finger. She took her cup to the table near the window and looked out and set the cup down and watched the ring it made and thought of the towel. Leaving, she went past a small boy pressing both his hands to the window to make faces at his reflection. The boy's reflection met his hands and then, in a way both comic and wrong, clapped almost. It had the timing of a person who'd been taught to wait for applause. The boy laughed because children and laughter are bound well, and the old man at the corner table laughed because old men and children might be all that is allowed to be happy on days when a person wants to be everything. She walked fast to the bus because she did not want to ask the boy what he thought of his reflection. At home, quiet, she stood in the middle of the room and felt foolish. The only person here was the person whose mouth had learned to smile in pictures. She took the point and shoot from the table and left the phone hidden under the towel, not because she thought it would keep it from looking at her, but because even superstition is allowed a rest. She held the camera out and took a picture of the space. She wound and took another toward the kitchen and the place where the thermos thought. On the third, she took herself not full on, but the way she preferred it. A person near the side of a room on a Monday, as a window decided whether afternoon would be kind. When she looked at them later, she saw her own face and a piece of the towel in the corner and the plant that had grown into several iterations of itself. In one of the three, the coat stood behind her shoulder and reversed the angle she had chosen so that it would flatter her jaw. It took the line of the jaw and made it into a descent. She set the camera on the table and noticed the quiet in the apartment and felt she had introduced an animal without introducing it to the other animals. The week had a rhythm and she let herself live it. Work open and close, talking to people gently because that is who she is. And because if she is gentle to them, they are gentle in return. And this is a rule she believes in more than in stones and rivers. It was not a week where anyone cried, not in front of her, The fridge clicked into one hum and stayed there. The towels were never folded exactly as her mother had convinced her to fold them, and she did not punish herself for that, because a towel that dries is a good towel. She dreamt of the coat twice. In one dream, she was in a hallway not hers, and the coat hung on a hook, and she had to try to find the hook that would let her remove it, and she woke up with the feeling of being too slow. In the other, she was in a room filled with water up to her sternum, and the coat floated face down, and she tried to pull it up, not because she wanted to see whether it had a face, but because something in her had learned that coats should not get wet. And then came the night, when the building decided, without consulting her or the landlord, to perform its power outage trick again. The lights went, and the fridge sighed, and she lit a candle with the muscle memory of last time. On her way to the drawer, she thought she saw a person move in the glass of the living room window, and because the possessed become practical, she picked up her phone and decided it should be allowed to tell her if there were people in her apartment at night. She opened the camera. She kept it close to her chest because she did not want to give it the respect of treating it like something to be aimed. She liked the little pretense of being indifferent. She walked to the window and took a picture of the glass. Behind her in the reflection, the coat stood and lifted a hand, and she lifted one and watched the hands meet in two planes. She asked quietly, the small question of a person who knows no answer will come, "What do you want?" And the coat did not answer because a reflection cannot. The mouth in the reflection shaped something that might have been the beginning of a smile before the room refused it. She lowered the phone and looked into the glass and saw that the reflection had its own dimness. Because the room had its movement, and in the dimness there was a second that she now tells herself is true, in which the reflection's hand stayed longer than hers on the glass before the coat dropped it. The fridge made a noise like agreement or apology. On the last day of that month, when the trees pretended spring and the city encouraged them with a kindly lie, she woke with an unkind calm that comes after a series of manageable days. She was in the habit now of looking at fallible surfaces. She looked in the dark kettle and saw her own eye and saw a different angle of it, not a fearful angle, a curious one. She looked in the window and saw a person behind her with a coat who lifted a hand to check a phone she did not hold. She looked in her phone and saw a person who was her, who was lifted half an inch away from herself by a device that had learned the wrong things. If you end a story because the event has exhausted you, most events hide in your stories and wait for a person to be unprepared. She decided to choose her ending. She went into the hallway and knocked on Jem's door with her fist, because a hand is a kind of door, and she had learned something about hands this week. Jem opened and did not feign surprise, because a friend can, at last, be asked to be simple. "Come," Jem said, and made a place for her in a room that smelled like toast. The fridge in this room had a hum that did not try to be sophisticated. The towels were folded badly, and it looked like luck. She said the words, "There is a coat in my pictures and in my reflections, and sometimes it acts as if it knows what I will do before I do it." She waited, and Jem did not tell her about magic. Jem did not tell her about men. Jem did not tell her about screens. Jem said, "Stay here tonight," in the tone of a person whose apartment had wised up to housing people in rooms that are not theirs. In the afternoon, they made a decision without requesting to name it: videos and mirrors and the authority of other devices. She stood in Jem's kitchen and held the phone where it could see her, and there was only her. She set the phone down and looked at the glass of the microwave, the glass of the oven door. In both, behind her, the figure in the coat pretended to read a screen and then did not. In Jem's generous mirror, where the silver had thinned in a way, scars on the mind like, the reflection raised both hands 3 seconds before she did. Jem watched with her and did not look away, because there is a friendship that makes it possible to look together and not die. Jem said, "Maybe your body is teaching itself something. There is a paper about it. Readiness. You decide before you know it. Maybe you see the decision in the glass first. Maybe you always have, and now you see that you see. She spoke softly enough that the room would not offer anything in response. "And the coat?" she asked. "Maybe a shape your eyes invented to make the thing bearable. Bodies like shapes when they need rules." Jem did not insist. She made tea. She set mugs on the table and did not care about the rings. She put a towel down for later and did not lift it if a ring happened anyway, and did not make a show of how this would be their generous habit. She stayed. The couch was hard, and she liked it because she deserved a hard couch, and because a soft couch might have made her mind too willing to take childhood's shape. The hum-to-silence cycle here was a stranger's. She let it teach her something different. It did not stop. That is not the way of these stories. It continued, but its shape changed in the quiet way a lesson does when it learns what it needs from you and not more. She grew less interested in the device's versions, and the device learned to stop insisting. The coat in the window still appeared in certain corners and in certain lights. It is worst when candlelight is the kind that turns the room into a story and your face into someone else's. The reflection still reached when she did, and sometimes in mornings, when the skin between worlds is thin, and you have slept in a manner that leaves your mouth still, with the feeling of having spoken. The reflection started a gesture a part of her wanted to finish. She learned which ones belonged to her. She did the adult things. She replaced the bulb in the hallway herself because the landlord forgot, and a person is allowed to reach high for her own light. She changed passwords not because of Lyle, but because of ordinary prudence. She allowed herself the small ridiculousness to tape a small circle of paper over the front-facing camera, whose eye is always seeking. She named the feeling when she woke too early, the one that says stay and says go, and says nothing will be different if you move into a different shape. She made lists again. They had nothing to do with coats. She stopped going to the garden for a while, not because of glass or because of coats, but because the garden had given her enough bright, and she needed to see other kinds. She went to the market and watched a woman choose the lemons that were less beautiful. She went to a car wash and watched a teenager braided into the window, with the water spray make a gesture that belonged to the coat and belonged to delight. Lift, look, down. She took a bus at night all the way to the industrial lots where houses end, and saw in the reflection of the plexiglass the man behind her lift a hand before she did and check a phone that he had not brought, and realized they were all closer to each other at least than stories ever make us. On a Tuesday in April, the three-legged cat let her pet it on the way up the stairs, and the coat in the glass of the door outside lifted its hand to demonstrate how much friendliness is allowed in a city like this. She put her hand to the glass with a small laziness that had in it no fear. The space on the other side was cold, and that was comforting because the cold was for this and not for anything else. She removed her hand and carried the towel upstairs because towels are for this too. The ending is a quiet one. She stands in her kitchen making tea out of habit. The traffic light at the bottom of Station Road holds yellow a breath too long and then apologizes. The fridge hums and then doesn't. The phone lies under a towel in daylight like a thing the house has politely chosen to let be. In the window, a coat lifts a hand to check a phone that isn't there, and the hand in the window touches the glass, because that is what the living do when faced with themselves at a distance. They reach, and their reaching arrives half a second before their decision. After a while, that feels, finally, like a mercy.